If you want to open up in your Old Testament to Psalm 19, the 19th Psalm, we'll begin there in just a moment. It seems to me that the most basic truth that we could point out is the fact that God exists. I know it's really basic, but that's getting at the heart of things. And for most of us, I'm sure that has pretty much been a given. Some of us maybe have never even given a great deal of thought about why we believe in God. We just do. We always have. But I want to ask you a question this evening. How can we know that God exists? How can we know what God is like? And how can we know how we relate to Him? Clearly, those are all important questions. And in our study this evening, I want us to talk some about reasons for belief in God. We're going to do more than that, but we're going to talk about that as well. We'll not only look at some reasons for belief in God, but also some reasons for believing in the God who is revealed to us in the pages of the Bible. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can have a relationship with Him as well. And as we start talking about God, we're going to actually begin with the creation. And one thing I'd like for us to see this evening is that even the natural world indicates that there is a God. Gives us even some insights into what God is like. And so the universe is an example of God's handiwork. It bears His imprint upon it. Here in Psalm 19 and verse 1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork." And so what that tells us is that the universe not only reveals to us God's existence, but it also gives us a little bit of insight into what He's like. Most people understand that complex and orderly things, they don't just appear out of nowhere. Things like complexity and order are evidence of a creator. And I recognize that there may be times when maybe we come across something that has the appearance of being designed that really is nothing more than a coincidence. You may come across, a rock that kind of looks like an arrowhead, but it's not really one. Kind of looks like it, and it just happens to be that way. Or, for example, many of you maybe have seen, I don't know how well you can see it, this image that comes from Mars and kind of looks, that top part up there, when the shadow is just right, it kind of looks like a face, And we look at that, and there are people, of course, who say, yep, that's exactly what it is. The aliens did it. Aliens are always the answer, just in case, you're wondering. And that's their view of that. But most people recognize that that's just kind of coincidental. The way the landscape is and the way the shadow is sort of makes that look like a face. But there are times when we know that there's something more than coincidence going on. If you were traveling in South Dakota and you saw the likenesses of 4 presidents on the side of a mountain, you wouldn't look at that and say, man, what a coincidence that is. I mean, that looks just like Washington and Jefferson, Lincoln and Roosevelt. I mean, how did that happen? You wouldn't do that. You would recognize that those faces had been carved into the side of Mount Rushmore. You would get that that's what was going on. Now, if you were to visit a place that you hadn't been in a long time, maybe you went out of town, you come back and happen to notice either a building or a house that is built on what was once an empty lot, you wouldn't think, that just kind of evolved there while I was gone. That's not how that works. We know that. Houses are designed and they're built by someone, aren't they? We get that. We understand that principle. Well, what we need to understand is that the same is true when we begin to talk about what we see in the universe. In fact, the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4 makes that very point. He says there that every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. God is the one who is behind all of that. That fact is self-evident. The fact that we see things out there and those things have an order to them and they're complex, that is an indication of the fact that they were created. And so there is no doubt that the universe that we live in is complex and orderly. The sun is a gigantic ball of burning gas. It has a gravitational pull that's strong enough to keep our planet orbiting around it. The earth is spinning in such a way that we have night and we have day. It tilts one direction and then it tilts the other direction so that we have different seasons. In some parts of the world, they have as many as 4 of those things. I don't know how they get those, but we're maybe having a little bit of experience with that right now. What a coincidence, right? Well, no, that's not it at all. The heavens declare the glory of God. Back in 1966, Time magazine ran a cover story with this title, "Is God Dead?" And the thought was that as science progressed, there was less need for God to explain what we see in the universe. And there's still a lot of scientists who view things that way. There's no need for God. I mean, it just kind of all works on its own. And not all of them, but many. But I ran across an article a number of years back, several years back, that was described this way in the table of contents. Science and religion have always had moments of conflict. Just ask Galileo, it said. But a wave of scientists and believers says discoveries about the universe support spirituality and hint at the very nature of God. And the article itself, it talked about a physicist by the name of Alan Sandage. He won a Nobel Prize at some point, so he's a pretty smart guy. He was the one who discovered all the principles that underlie the laser, and so if you've benefited from that in some way at some point in time, he's the one that kind of helped with that. And he came to believe in God when he was 50 years old, so a really young guy at that point, or something like that. And he said, it was science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. He recognized that there had to be a God. And again, the creation demands that there must be a creator. And I believe it tells us some things about him as well. And Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 1. Romans 1 verses 18 and following, Paul talks about the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth, he says. And then in verse 19, of Romans 1, he says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse," he says. And so first, Paul talks about one of God's invisible attributes being his eternal power. It's obvious that the one who created all things is powerful. I mean, that's kind of one of those, it's kind of an understatement. To bring the universe into existence with all of the energy that is present within it says something about the tremendous power that was necessary to make that happen. And it's also obvious that the one who created all things had to exist before whatever it was that was created. The world was created by someone who existed from eternity, someone who continues to exist and who continues to hold it all together. And so the universe not only is a demonstration of tremendous power, but also of permanent power as well. God existed before time, he continues to exist in the present, and he will continue on forever. And so time, at least as we know it, is something that is bound up with this creation. Think for a moment about how we determine time. And I don't mean by, look at your Apple Watch or at the clock in the back. I don't mean that way. It gets light and then it gets dark. What do we call that? It gets light again. Well, there you have a day. When the earth goes all the way around the sun, a year has passed. And so you see how time as we use it is connected with this world, with this creation. God existed before the creation of the world. He is an eternal power. He is outside of that. Paul also said that God's divine nature is revealed in the creation. And if we were to kind of just boil that down, I think what Paul was getting at is the fact that God's nature is not something that's derived from creation. It's not like a lot of the gods who were worshipped by pagans at various points in time, gods of rivers and gods of rocks and all that kind of stuff. He is outside. He is different from it. Creation is derived from God, not God from creation. He is divine. He is separate. And Paul made that very argument more than once, it seems to me. Let's go over to Acts chapter 17 for just a moment. Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens, and he is at the Areopagus, and in verse 22 it says, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he's actually not very far, or he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine nature or that the divine being is like silver or gold or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. God's not like us. He's not like the creation, is what he's saying. And so we can learn that there has to be a God. We look at the natural world, we learn a couple of things about him, but I think we need to recognize that this natural revelation, as we tend to call it, has some limitations, doesn't it? We're limited by the fact that we are a part of this creation and that God is not. Jesus would say in John 4 and verse 24 that God is spirit. And if God is spirit, then there are some things that we're just not going to be able to figure out about him on our own. You can't put him in a test tube and run tests on him and do things like that we can do with stuff in the physical world. He is spiritual, and all of our senses, all of them are geared toward the physical realm. John would say, in John 1 verse 18, that no one has ever seen God. He's not a part of the realm in which we live. And we have no way of discovering anything about him other than what has been revealed to us. And so what we learn about God from creation is kind of similar to what an archaeologist might learn in the study of some ancient society that vanished, thousands of years ago. He can find out certain things about that society. He can look at some of the things those people made and learn some things about them, but that doesn't necessarily mean he knows the people. His knowledge is limited. He can deduce certain things simply by what he observes. And I think the same thing is true when we look at what God has made. We can deduce that God exists. We can find out certain things about him. He's not like this world. He had to be powerful enough to make it. All of those things. He existed from eternity. But other than that, there's not a lot we can find out about him. And so the only way that we can truly know about God is if God chooses to reveal himself to us in a way that is intelligible, that is comprehensible. And what I want us to see with the time we have remaining this evening is that's exactly what he did in the person of Jesus Christ. I think it's great to talk about evidence for the existence of God. But the place that I believe we really need to stake our claim as Christians is on the identity of Jesus himself. Jesus is set forth in the New Testament as a reason for believing in God. He's the one who reveals God to mankind. As I quoted a moment ago from John 1 and verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but I didn't quote the rest of it. The one and only Son who is himself God and is at the Father's side, he has revealed him. Jesus reveals the invisible God. Or as Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 20 and 21, he would say that Christ was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for you. Through him you believe in God, Peter said, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory so that your faith and hope are in God. Through him you believe, Peter says. One of the most remarkable claims in the Bible is that Jesus of Nazareth was actually God in human flesh. And as one of our brothers in Christ argues it, I love his premise. He says, if Jesus is God, then God is. God exists. Jesus is God, then you know God exists. That's all the proof you really need about that. And it just naturally follows. And not only does God exist, again, the creation tells us that, but he can be identified. And we can know something more about him than the simple fact of his existence if Jesus is God. But how do we know if that claim's true? If Jesus really is, as Peter would say in Matthew 16 and verse 16, the Christ, the Son of the living God, God in human flesh, in other words, and then it seems to me that there ought to be some proof, right? You can't just make a claim like that without backing it up with evidence. And so what proof is there for the fact that this claim is true, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? I want us to take a few minutes this evening to talk about that with the time we have. And one thing I think it is important for us to recognize is that the story of Jesus, it doesn't begin in the New Testament. I think that's important for people to recognize. That many of the details of his life and of his death were recorded in the prophecies of the Old Testament long before Jesus came into the world. In fact, Jesus himself talked about that fact a number of times. He did that with his disciples. He did that with people who didn't believe in him. For example, on one occasion in John chapter 5, he is dealing with some unbelieving Jews, and they're actually seeking to kill him. These are not friendly people. And John tells us there in John 5 and verse 18 that not only was he breaking the Sabbath, these people thought, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. They looked at that, and Jesus would say to them in response to all of this, he would say in verse 39, as the story progresses, you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Now, when Jesus said, you search the Scriptures, he wasn't saying you looked through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's not what he's talking about. Those don't exist yet. He's talking about Genesis through Malachi. He's talking about the Old Testament Scriptures. And Jesus said, they bear witness about me. After Jesus was raised from the dead, in Luke chapter 24, he met two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. And Luke tells us in verse 27 of that chapter that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. Now, I'll just go ahead and tell you, I'd like to have a recording of that because I'd like to know what all that is about and where the passages that deal with that. We know some of them, but I'm sure we've missed a few as well. He would later say to a gathering of his disciples, that same chapter Luke 24 and verse 44, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms might be fulfilled. So there's stuff about Jesus in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. All through the Old Testament, Jesus said there is stuff about him. It's been said that there are more than 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that relate to the Messiah. I don't know who counted them. I didn't do that. But I have read that number in various places that kind of is consistent, 300. And there's obviously no way we can look at all of those this evening, but I do want us to look at a few of them tonight. I'm not sure that there's any one prophecy that would necessarily convince someone who doesn't believe in Jesus that he is the Christ. But I will tell you this, it's almost impossible not to see it when you start taking this prophecy from here and that one from there and kind of putting the pieces together. It's almost like a mosaic. You know, you ever seen a mosaic? It's these little pieces that are put together, and you might, if you're just looking at one section, you may think, okay, I'm not really sure what exactly it is that I'm looking at there. Okay? See all these little individual things, but what's up with that? I don't know what's going on. But when you start putting all of the pieces together and eventually you see a picture, it kind of comes together, right? I think that's how prophecy works. One of the prophecies about Jesus that I want us to talk about this evening pertains to his birth. The prophet Micah, in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, would say, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days, or from everlasting, some translations say. As Matthew would say in Matthew 2 and verse 1, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. That was foretold. In the days of Herod the king, he was. And so that was foretold hundreds of years before it came to pass. Now, as I said, that might not convince anyone that Jesus was the promised Messiah all by itself. They just go back to Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 and read that and come to Matthew 2 and verse 1 and read that's where he was born and say, that's it, he's the Messiah, he's the Son of the living God. No, that might not be how that works. But when you start adding things to that, other prophecies, Isaiah foretold that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. In Isaiah 7 and verse 14, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us, Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 1. And one of the interesting things about this prophecy is that the one who would be born of a virgin, again, yes, he is going to be God with us. And when you add to that the fact that Micah said that he would be born in Bethlehem and he would be a ruler, you begin to flesh out the picture of who is this person that's being talked about. Something many people in the first century didn't know is that the Old Testament scriptures also spoke of the Messiah's rejection. They said that he would be rejected. In Luke chapter 24 and verse 25, Jesus points out that very thing to his disciples. He would say, "Oh, foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" That's exactly what the Scripture said would happen. And of course, there might be a variety of passages that talk about that. Probably the clearest one is Isaiah chapter 53. He was, well, actually, let's just go over there for a moment. Isaiah chapter 53. And we won't take the time to read everything that is said. But when you begin to look at the picture that is painted, it's, again, you start putting tiles in place, and it's starting to look a whole lot like Jesus. In verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Again, you kind of put those pieces in place, and you start seeing the picture more clearly. I don't think it's without coincidence that when the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 was reading from that very passage in Isaiah chapter 53, that Philip could go up to him, and as it says in Acts 8 and verse 35, he opened his mouth, and beginning with this scripture, Isaiah 53, he told him the good news about Jesus. It's not hard to do because, this is about him. But I want to tell you, I want to move on. I want to show you that the miracles of Jesus, those prophecies about him, they tell us about who he is, and they point us in the right direction. But the miracles of Jesus, I think, also point to him being the Messiah. When Nicodemus came to Jesus by night in John chapter 3, he would say to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God." Well, how do you know that? He says, "For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with you," or God is with him. Nobody can do these things just of their own. I don't know that Nicodemus quite recognized Jesus as the Messiah at this point, but he was headed in the right direction. He knew that there was one explanation and one explanation only for the signs that Jesus did, and that is that God was with him. Jesus himself would point people to his miracles as proof of his identity. In John chapter 10, in verse 37, for example, he would say, or verse 25 actually, "The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me." The things that I do, they show who I am. And then a few verses later in verse 37, "If I'm not doing the works of my Father, then don't believe me," Jesus says. "But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, even though you don't take my word for it," Jesus was saying, "believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father's in me and I am in the Father." Look at what I do and come to the right conclusion about that. Same one Nicodemus came to. No one can do these things unless God's with him. When John the Baptist heard about the works of Jesus from prison, after he'd been put in prison, he sent some of his disciples. And in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 3, they said, "Are you the one who is to come," the one that's talked about in the Old Testament, or shall we look for another? Did we get this wrong? Are you the Messiah or not? And Jesus responded to that question in verse 4 by saying, he didn't say, "Yeah, of course I am. Go and tell John, quit being ridiculous." He said, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me." You just go tell him, just give him the evidence. Let him figure that out. He was doing the very things the Old Testament said the Messiah would do. There were prophecies that said the Messiah would do these things, these miracles. On the day of Pentecost, when the gospel was preached in its fullness for the first time, Peter in Acts 2 and verse 22 would say, "Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know." You guys know this, he said. This is not something he did in a corner. He didn't do this in secret. And these signs and all these different words, these works and wonders and signs, all of these things pointed to who Jesus was. And so the Apostle John would say that the miracles of Jesus, they ought to be sufficient to lead someone to have faith in him as the Christ, as the Son of God. When you read the Gospel of John, one thing you notice is that, again, he records miracle after miracle after miracle. And then he gets to the end of the book in John 20 and verse 30 and says, "Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. These things are sufficient to bring a person to have faith in Jesus. And of course, the greatest sign of all that would point to who Jesus was his resurrection from the dead. You know, when the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the church in Rome, he would start it off by saying that Christ was set apart, or that Paul was set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. We talked about that already, concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. That's that whole ruler from Bethlehem aspect of things. And was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. It showed who Jesus was, demonstrated that he is the Son of, not just the Son of God, he is the Son of God in power. It is an indispensable part of the gospel of Christ. It's part of those things that are of first importance we saw this morning as we read from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in the first few verses. And so as we bring things to a close this evening, look again at what Peter said about Jesus in 1 Peter 1, verses 20 and 21. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world. It goes back even beyond the Old Testament. He's in eternity past. But was made manifest, or he was revealed in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. That's what Jesus does for us. He shows us what God is like. He gives us a reason to believe, and he gives us hope. You know, there may be many things we could talk about that point to the existence of God, but I really can't think of anything better we could talk about than Jesus. You see, he not only gives us proof of God's existence, but he also shows us how we can live with him eternally. Jesus would say of himself in John 14 and verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So if we want to be right with him, if we want to be right with God, we've got to go to Jesus. He's the only way to get there. And the only way to do that is to obey the gospel of Christ. When that good news was preached for the first time on the day of Pentecost, after Jesus was raised from the dead, in Acts chapter 2, Peter kind of laid things out before the people who had been guilty of putting him to death. And Peter told those who were interested, in making things right, here's how you need to respond. And he would say to them in Acts 2 and verse 38, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. That's how they were to respond. And that's just what we call upon people to do today. We haven't come up with a better way of responding to the Lord. We just picked the way that the Scriptures themselves point out. We point people there for the answer. That's the only place you're going to find the answer. It's when what God has revealed in his word. And so if you've never done that, then why not tonight? Oh, there's plenty of evidence for God's existence. And plenty of evidence for the fact that Jesus is his Son, who reveals God to us, who makes him known, and provides to him our only access. And so if you need to respond tonight, then why not come? Why not come as we stand and as we sing?